All right, so this is going to be a lecture on how to animate properties within Unity. So I'm just going to start with the basics of a character that moves around using WASD. The idea is that you can use the animation tool to animate things like sword swings, so that's what we're going to do. I wanted to start off first by showing just a basic kind of sword that I'm just going to use a cylinder to make here. So I'm going to do this. Rename this guy to be a sword, and I'm going to parented him to the capsule, and I'm going to rotate him about X 90 degrees, like so. And let's just move him so he's slightly offset and forward of the player. I think that sword looks good. It's a giant sword. I'm going to stick a color sheet on him. One of these. Cool. So the sword you can animate by opening up the animation window here. And by default, the animation window expects that you're going to have the object that you want to animate selected. So you click on Add Curve to pick a new property to animate. And I'm going to go to the Animations folder. And I already had a sword swing from a previous demonstration that I wasn't recording. So I'm going to save a new one called Sword Swing and just replace the old one. And now when I click Add Curve, I get all these properties of what I want to animate. And specifically here, I want to animate the rotation. And I think I'm going to animate the scale too, because part of making sword swings look good is that it kind of skews and gets distorted. So I think it'd be cool if it actually kind of skewed and distorted as well, got bigger as it swung. And we can add like a motion trail to it too, which will make it look even better. So this rotation curve that's been added allows us to rotate each axis independently, and these are directly tied to the rotation of the transform. Look at here, I have the rotation of X, Y, and Z highlighted in pink. It's currently actually recording right now, and it's a half-second animation. So it's playing this over half a second. What I can do is I can have it rotate maybe 90 degrees about the Y. So now as it plays, it does that. And maybe I kind of want to start slow and then go fast, right? So maybe I'll add another key here. Maybe this is actually animating a little too slow. So what I'll do here is I'll actually have it stall a little bit. So I'm going to add a new set of keys right around the halfway point. I'm going to set the rotation to be 0 again. Now what that's going to do is that's going to make that sword stay at that rotation and then catch up later. So it actually rotates from here, which is 0, to 90 in these last few frames. Does that make sense? So it goes to 0. And what's weird is that it's actually going to be blending. I don't actually want this curve of the rotation to do this thing. Whereas you see how the curve is actually dipping down here? And instead, what I want to kind of do is do that. And so it's not quite, it's not going to go into the negative here. And you can also have handles show up here if you want. And what I really want to do is I just want to delay the swing. And I don't really want to have a curve here like this. I kind of just want it to be flat. So it stays at 0 and then quickly ramps up to be at 90. And what that looks like now is when I play, it basically in the last half, maybe I can even accentuate this more. See how it swings much faster for the last part because I moved the key up? And I kind of want a lag time. And maybe I want this thing, maybe I want the beginning of the animation to actually have a little bit of a wind up to it. So this guy here, instead of just being 0, I'll actually have it be -20. So it actually animates backwards a little bit. So it has like a little bit of wind up before it goes. Like that. Okay. And let's fix this now because it's kind of weird that it's orienting around the center of the cylinder. And instead, what I really wanted to do is rotate around the pivot point. So I'm going to create a pivot here. And I'm going to have this pivot parented to the player just like I do the sword. So I'm going to reset the position of this thing. So there's my pivot right there. It's right on player. I'm actually going to move the pivot to where I want him to be holding the sword. And now I'm actually going to parent the sword to the pivot. Reset the sword again. But this time, I can move the sword in front, and when I rotate the pivot, oops. I want to rotate the sword. The pivot here. Let's do this. I'm going to unparent this for a second. Move the sword all the way out in front of the pivot, and then I'm going to transform the pivot here. That's what I wanted. This button will allow you to control the rotation of it, so I want that, right? I want this sword to swing around the pivot, so like I'm swinging a baseball bat. And I know it doesn't look like a sword, just bear with me here. So what I can do is I can just have the animation played on the pivot instead. So this animation is currently being played on the sword, but instead what I want to do is actually have it played on the pivot so that it looks like I'm actually swinging the sword correctly. So I can go back in here, and I can add a curve, or I can also take this component here, which is currently set up to play the sword. And it's kind of nicer if you just make a new curve here. And I should have done this at first. I'm going to override the old animation. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the rotation, add a curve for it. This time the sword pivot's going to have a 0 rotation here, and it's going to go to 90 degrees at the end. And I will stop recording for a second. This should be at 0 rotation to start. So see how the sword is now swinging as I would expect, and I can move it here, and I can actually rotate it slightly to the left, so it has a little bit of wind up. Okay. And I can shrink this guy here, so the sword swing is just faster. Okay. Maybe I even want it faster than that. I think that seems good, right? So now that I've authored this animation, I can trigger this animation to play when I want. I've saved this animation, and it's played as a sword swing. This is the actual animation that I've baked out. And what's cool is that this sword goes with me where I go, as long as I've parented it to the capsule. And it's animating like that. So we know that it's rotating. But I don't want it to animate right away. Right? I don't want it to animate when it starts. I'm actually going to get rid of this one. And instead, I'm going to have this thing be triggered on an animation that I play normally. Sword pivot. I'm not going to get into the animator yet. Let me just do this. Apply motion. So now if I move around, the sword doesn't animate, and I'm going to instead trigger that to be played as an animation that's based around the like an event that I fired. Just like the chest was opening was an animation that played when you walked up to it or when you interacted with it, we can add a playmaker action so that when you click the mouse, the sword actually plays as an animation. So I'm going to add a playmaker FSM to this thing, and I just want it to say have a 2 states. One that is waiting to swing, and another one is called swing sword. And waiting to swing is just going to say, hey, get mouse button down. Left mouse button is going to trigger me to swing the sword. Like so. And swing sword is going to add a new action that we already used before, play animation. Use the owner. This object, what's that? I need to make sure that this thing has, this should be showing up. Oh, I may have missed one thing. We're going to add an animation on top of it. So animation, an animation component is basically a collection of all the animations you want this thing to be able to play. In this case, I want to add a sword swing animation here, which will let me have this thing show up with the proper animation name here. So the idea is that when you want to play an animation on a guy, add an animation component so the playmaker knows about it. And I'm not sure if I might be missing one more thing. I just have to remember if there's anything else that I forgot. Yeah, so it's missing the animation for sword swing. We're going to do that. have it not play automatically. Okay. Disable this thing. Get rid of the controller. And I'm missing one more thing, which I always forget. Animation clip. Open this guy up. Where is... There we go. So this guy has a sword swing animation, and I've added him to the list. I always am missing something. Yeah, weird. I lost the animation that was on there. Huh. Okay. Weird. That did not have the clip on it before. That's odd. I don't know why that didn't save the animation, because it should have showed up here. I think I didn't actually save it properly. So let's do one more step. 90 degrees here. See if that works. Cool. Stop recording. Close this. We're going to add sword swing 2 here. Get rid of that. That is set correctly. Shouldn't ever have to worry about that stuff. That is correct here. That is set to play the animation of what we want. The animator is, you know, I don't think we need this. I think here, yeah, I don't know why there's no, sorry, I'm not sure actually why there's no legacy option here, because it should be able to play this animation, but I'm not seeing why. So I'm missing animation. Sword pivot is there. Sword swing is there. Yeah, I can't find it because this thing isn't marked as legacy because it was created for the wrong version of Unity. This used let's make sure this is actually correct. Loop time. think is actually my version of Playmaker. My version of Playmaker is not compatible with the version of the animation system here. That's the only reason I can think of. Because this should just work. If you set up an animation and then you have it listed in here, and then you tell it to play, it'll play the animation correctly. Just like this, this chest has animations here, but these animations are marked differently. See how those animations actually have a different set of properties compared to my sword swing animation? Yeah, it's my version of Playmaker in Unity. Okay, so we're going to have to do this a different way. So I'll show you guys another way to work around this issue. Instead of actually triggering the animation, we can also take this animation, which is currently playing automatically. So when this thing is set to swing, hey, it's missing it. Okay. Okay, let's just do this where we actually disable. We're going to do this where this animation, this animator is set to play, but not automatically. So we can trigger this thing to play. We can enable and disable this animation component when we click the button, which will allow us to play the animation by just hiding or unhiding the object. Now, this thing. And I have to make this thing looping again. So what we can do is let it play the animation, stop, and then we'll just enable and disable the component when we need to as well, which we can do here. Because I don't know why I can't make an animation that plays with this version of Playmaker. I have to figure out that. We'll just have it stop all. Instead of doing a play animation, we will have this thing call activate object, and I am going to take this thing, oh, I am editing the wrong guy. Kind of getting into the weeds here. I'm not really sure if there actually is another way, because I was hoping that I could actually disable this object when I needed to play the animation, but really the proper way to do it is to play this animation here when you trigger it, and that causes this thing to actually trigger the sword swing animation. The only issue is that when you make an animation in here and try to play it in a newer version of Playmaker, it doesn't know how to handle an animation made. You can actually see the error messages show up here saying, hey, I don't know what the animation is, and it needs to be marked differently than what it is now. So let's try this. I'm just going to try to find a way to do this so I can salvage at least some of the animations that I made. Here. Yeah, these are all fine. I don't actually know of a way to do that. Okay. There's a sword swing. Here's my rotation. That's what I need here. The animator is only something that is used to control scripting, like, hey, I want to move from walking to running, or I want to like play a jump. But this is intended to be used when you don't have something to script that behavior, and isn't really intended to be used when you have something that is controlling it through Playmaker. Like, for instance, if you look at the chest, and we put this chest in the level, it only has an animation component. It doesn't actually have anything else. If I do this guy here, he has an opening and a closing animation, which is a shame because these are exactly the same thing as the sword swing animation that was made up here. The only difference is that these are actually marked as legacy animations. I wonder if there's no way to mark that as such. I was hoping that there was some way to say, hey, this thing is actually going to be mark this thing as legacy so that it knows how to handle it, but I don't actually think there is a way to do that. Let's just find out here. Yeah. Interesting. Project window. It's like debug from the drop-down window. Wow. Really? That's how you set it as a legacy? Change the animation type to be 1, which will now work. That is really, really silly. So the reason is that Playmaker doesn't know how to handle the new animations that are made by, this is something new that wasn't happening the last time I did this. And because I have a version of Unity that's like the most recent version as well. But here, the sword swing animation is playing now, and only because this animation, which I've never known this before, where there's a normal and a debug dropdown for this. The animation type must be the old version of the animation that Playmaker actually is able to use. And it used to be 2, which Playmaker doesn't know how to play. When I set it to 1, now Playmaker all of a sudden can play it when I swing and click the mouse. Cool. So we all learned something there. Let's do just a little bit more, and then I'm going to call it. Let's take this guy, and I'm going to add a curve for his scale, because maybe I want him to get bigger as he swings. So I can start him off with a scale of 0.1, like so. Cool. And then we can add the wind up again. Kind of slow. We're going to make it that much faster. think this seems like a better animation here. So assuming that you can set your animations to be legacy, you can author them here and then use them for your guy. And maybe for something like, let's say we have a jump animation, right? Let's do one more thing. Let's have this capsule. We're going to make an animation for this capsule now. I select the capsule, and I'm going to have it called jump. And all I want to do is kind of just scale the animation and maybe have him move up. So I'm going to take the scale because I kind of want him to squash and stretch. And I'm not an animator or anything like that, but I think that you could do things where you can author scale. So I have this capsule. Oh, I didn't save the clip. Cool. Cool. That's interesting because the camera is attached to the capsule that actually moves the capsule around. And then what we can do is we can do the same thing, go to jump, go to the freaking debug page, set the animation type to be 1 so it's legacy, and then we'll just go to his playmaker component, and we'll say, hey, if you get key down, if you press space, jump, idle, jump. We'll just have this thing play an animation. And this thing needs to have an animation component again. And we will add the jump animation here to his animation set. So it shows up here. So now when I run around and I hit spacebar, he plays an animation. It's kind of up to you as far as like, that's actually really funny too, because he scales, he gets pop up in the air because he has a rigid body. But I mean, these are kind of convoluted examples, but I think that the flexibility of doing this through the animator is a little easier than necessarily using like iTween, right? So normally if I wanted to have a platform that moves left and right, I would set up like this platform, and I would typically like attach a script to this thing that says, hey, as long as you're active, do like an iTween move. And I would just have it move by, I don't know, positive like 10, and then do ping pong. But if I ever wanted to do more than one movement at a time, like let's say I wanted to move up to one way, then right, then back down, like that's not something as easy to do with iTween. Instead, what you could just do is have an animation on it. You pick the cube, animate, save this, I'm going to call it platform, go to the transform, add a position transform, and you basically start just recording. So this is position 0. At about 1 second, I want it to be here, and at about 1.5 seconds, maybe 2 seconds, I want it to be here, and at about 3 seconds, I want to be back down here, making sure that my positions on the start and the finish, the X position here, match up. So I click on the first keyframe, it's at 7, This one is at 20, so I'm just going to make this thing be 7, and this guy is also going to be 7. Okay, what happened to this guy? Oh, because he wasn't supposed to be at 7. Oops, this guy should be at 20. And remember, it's using curves. Oh, and it's not actually going back to the beginning, so we need one more key here. That's going to be somewhere around here. I'm just going to copy. Yeah, exactly 7, and cycle back. So the difference, the reason why it's also like kind of swinging between the points and kind of blending is because you can switch to the curve view. Because these curves for the transform position, I don't know if you guys have ever animated stuff in Maya or Max. Has anyone done in animation courses? This should look very similar to that stuff. Because these curves kind of have swinging behavior, instead of having like all these things be based on curves, you can have them be like that. You can smooth them, you can flatten them out so they don't actually do that weird thing. So now he moves flat to each one, but he still like eases into each one. And the amount that he eases into each case, you can tweak. And so notice here on this last key, he bounces. Same with this. So you can kind of animate whatever you need to, and this is just a looping. That's why it's just repeating this over and over again. Or you could just make these things be identical. You can flatten them out and adjust tangents as you need to. Okay. All right. The most cases that I've used this are for like explosions, like things dying, like enemies blowing up. Like you want to play an animation of him exploding. You kind of want him to scale up and kind of tweak out a little bit. Or like power-ups or pickups. You want them to have some kind of interesting behavior. You can author an animation that lets you play that. As long as you remember that in Playmaker, it won't play it unless you go click on the animation, click on this button, go here and change that to be 1, which I've never had to do before.